So now we're going to dive into how do these systems for the electricity that they generate. And you're going to see some numbers, I think, that are going to surprise you. The source for this data is the Energy Information Association, which again, I consider to be an unbiased source. And here they're computing the levelized cost of electricity for new generation services entering service in 2025. In other words, if we have to build a new facility and then it produces for its hour, or for, I'm sorry, for its lifespan, how much is the electricity going to cost? And so I put in this red box over here the total levelized cost of electricity, including all of their tax credits. And here the low number is good. You can see in the fossil-based fuels, or what they call the dispatchable technologies, which I guess would include nuclear, geothermal, and biomass. The only one that is attractive is the combined cycle, which is the most up-to-date natural gas plant. Coal, way too expensive. Nuclear, way too expensive. Biomass, way too expensive. Geothermal, yeah, but only so much you can do. So then you look at, all right, what about with I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought. Now let's directly compare that to onshore wind, offshore wind, and solar. You can see that offshore wind is many, many fold more expensive. This is the new kid on the block. We'll look at how the prices have dropped in some of the other technologies. We would expect this price to drop. How much? Hard to say, but even if it came down, let's say into the 50s or 60s, which would be an appreciable drop, it would still be considerably more expensive than these are. With the subsidies, you can see that, and the way they're doing the math, onshore wind doesn't get a subsidy because the tax credit is supposed to expire. They're a little bit cheaper than a natural gas plant. And so you hear people say, it just doesn't work if it's not subsidized. Sorry, it does. It actually does. Now, it didn't 5 years ago, but that's the purpose of the tax credits. And all the support that it got from the government was to get you through that steep learning curve. And now that they're through that steep learning curve, it is in fact cost competitive. Here is a more current analysis. I couldn't find a newer EIA analysis. This is by an investment bank called Lazard. I like using investment bank data because they're paid to make money. They're not paid to fudge numbers. You can see a very cool analysis. Rooftop solar is not cost competitive per kilowatt hour compared to the utility. Why is that in a lot of cases? It's because of the commissions that the companies get for installing them, and because there's less economies of scale and the construction costs are higher than they are for these. But a lot of it, frankly, is the commission. So in terms of affordable, the big winners are utility scale solar and wind, and down here, this is the natural gas. But notice Lazard shows it is significantly higher. The other key thing is this is unsubsidized. This is no tax credits. This is their numbers. This red circle I've got over here for wind, this is Lazard's 2020 number for offshore wind. So considerably lower than the EIA number, but you can see many, many times higher than this. Why the band? It has to do with where it's located, blah, blah, blah. I think some of these numbers are overly generous because they count on really good siting. In other words, a place where the wind resource is really good and a place where the solar resource is really good. Some of those places are already taken, and where it's being built is not as good of a spot. Whereas gas combined cycle, location matters here because the price of natural gas varies considerably around the country, but obviously the construction cost doesn't vary. But if we're talking about affordability going forward, you can see it's utility scale solar, wind, and natural gas. And we can argue about these little numbers here, up and down, but those are the three cost effectives. Here's the problem with this analysis, though. What penalty do these play for not being dispatchable? In this price analysis, they don't. And so this goes back to that question I had for you on the very first night of class. How much price break would you be willing, or would you expect if somebody guaranteed you something less than 100% reliability? And for you at least, it was a pretty healthy price cut. So you could almost say, yes, these need to be cheaper because they cannot guarantee the reliability that this can. But in an economic analysis, that's something else that we have. This is also out of Lazard's presentation. What I wanted you to see is in terms of onshore wind, we are well down the cost reduction curve. There are still probably going to be incremental improvements, but they'll be relatively small. Solar, you can see that we still probably have some room to continue down the price reduction curve, but maybe not much, because this was where the very steep drop was. This is also out of the Lazard presentation, and I thought it was cool how they were just so clear about it. What I want you to focus on is this part of the chart. And we're going to talk more about electricity later, the grid later, but base load is the power that's always there. And then as you get over to this side, this is like, okay, I don't need it as much. Intermittent and peaking is just like when the demand is very high. But notice what it says about solar. It's only good for intermittent and peaking. Why peaking? Because solar tends to produce a lot in the afternoons, which is when electricity usage tends to be high. Notice that onshore wind is only rated as an intermittent source. As opposed to conventional, look at natural gas combined cycle. Base load, load following, and then gas peaking plants as well. So even the investment bank reminds us, hey, these things, the problem here is we have the issue of intermittency. Here is a great graph that shows you just the variation in onshore wind. So this is out of, the last year was 2019. This is how much wind energy was generated. And what I want you to see is that they're very predictable seasonal variations. When is wind down in a trough? In the hot summer months. When's at its peak? In the spring and in the fall, when electricity usage is not quite as high. And it's also good in the wintertime. So that's the issue of intermittency. The obvious question is, and I told you when I gave you that what does a hot day in Texas look like, that I was making solar and wind look as bad as possible. And I did, because if you want to make solar and wind look as bad as possible, go to a day when you're going to use a ton of energy, because they're just not going to keep up for all the reasons that you now well understand in this course. The obvious answer to this problem, if you are a believer that we need to dramatically cut CO2 emissions to preclude climate change, the obvious answer is what you do is you build as much renewables as you can, and you use them whenever they're available, and you store them when you can't use them, which is the battery issue that we'll discuss later. But what? But you keep all of that fossil fuel capability still online, or not online, but still available, so that if it's a hot day in Texas and the wind isn't blowing and the sun's going to set, and it's going to be, people are going to want to run their air conditioners all night long after the sun goes down, when the wind isn't blowing, then you fire up natural gas plants and you generate all your electricity with natural gas. That would be the solution, because in those periods of times when the renewables couldn't keep up, then you'd fire up the fossil fuel and you'd make up the distance. How much spare would we have to keep? Well, realistically, we would probably have to keep everything that we would need from 9 p.m. at night to about 9 a.m. in the morning, because that's when solar is going to be down. It would be a lot, in other words. And here's a country that has gone down this path. Germany has executed a very ambitious transition to a low carbon, and incidentally, they also took out their nuclear, which is part of the reason why their prices spiked so much. But this is what it did to their average household price. Before they started doing this, they were paying almost 24 cents per kilowatt hour, or double what we pay. And you can see it's now up around 30 cents per kilowatt hour. And this is simply keeping the fossil fuel resources available and letting wind and solar do whatever it can, whenever it can. But oh, by the way, even they didn't get the supply and demand quite right, because they've had some periods where, when they had unusually hot summers, they weren't able to generate enough electricity. This is what China is experiencing as I make this video, where they're starting to have some outages because they're trying to throttle back on their coal to keep their coal emissions down, but the renewables aren't doing all that they thought they could. So this is the solution. The problem is it's expensive. And so as we go forward, what's it going to take to make wind and solar, or not just wind and solar, but the whole electrical grid cleaner? Well, batteries right now are very expensive, and the idea of using batteries for significant storage to address the intermittency issue is, let's just say, it's going to dramatically drive prices up. Plus, the batteries are not optimally suited for this. And as we studied earlier, there's some pretty significant environmental ramifications for batteries. In the best answer, we would begin to do carbon capture on the coal and the natural gas plants to make them greener, to allow them to stick around. We would also like to see continued decreases in wind and solar. I don't think we're going to see dramatic decreases, though, but offshore wind, if the prices were to come down there to enable a lot of building, that would be a big deal. And then cheaper nuclear power. There are plenty of people who say that we are ignoring the greenest fuel out there in terms of scalability, and that's nuclear power. And they're right. So we're going to continue the class discussion. For this particular year, I have a couple of great guest speakers lined up. I hope I have great guest speakers lined up for every year that I use these videos. We're going to dive into some of these issues from the people who are actually making investments happen on the ground.